Good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure to welcome you to tonight's event, which is doubling as the fifth meeting of the Van Leer Public Series on talking about science in the 21st century, and as the keynote plenary talk of the 18th annual meeting of the Israeli Society for the History and Philosophy of Science. It's a special pleasure to introduce to you this evening our speaker, the Aramont Professor of the History of Science, Janet Brown. Janet began her studies in Dublin in zoology, and then decided after that she was going to go the way of history of science, and went to Imperial College London, where she gained a PhD working in particular on the history of biogeography. And when she completed that project, she decided to devote her time to Charles Darwin in a way that over the years has made her one of the world's great authorities on Charles Darwin, and perhaps the greatest living biographer of Charles Darwin. She did that to begin with as an associate editor of the early volumes of the correspondence of Charles Darwin. And I gather when she had done that for a number of years, she suddenly picked her head up and noticed that she knows quite a bit about Charles Darwin. And so decided to make a marriage between that knowledge, that very specialized and intimate knowledge, and her literary skills. And began a project which ended up becoming a beautiful 2-volume biography of Charles Darwin, which integrated Darwin's science and his life and times. That biography, which was published first as Voyaging and then The Power of Place. I think the first one came out in 1996 and the second one in 2002. That biographical project was framed, as I said, as a biography, but it really was a study of the ways in which scientific knowledge are produced, disseminated, and received by a given culture and other cultures, moving from the private sphere to the public sphere. And again, that was mirrored in the voyaging part, and then followed by The Power of Place. Those books are really a beautiful biography. There have been many, many biographies of Charles Darwin written. You guys have to read this biography because it gives you the most intimate feel for the man and his times. You feel like you are with him as he sails the high seas. You feel like you're with him as he tries to, crack the hardest problems that he's thinking about, from the smallest minutiae of tiny barnacles to the largest questions of the progress of life on planet Earth. It's a beautiful, beautiful biography, and Janet is a wonderful writer besides being an impeccable scholar. And that book rightly won many awards, including the James Tate Black Award for nonfiction, the W.H. Heinemann Prize for the Royal Literary Society, which gives you an idea of its literary merits, the Pfizer Prize from the History of Science Society, and also the National Book Critics Award for biography. Janet, I told you I was gonna embarrass you, so just hold your horses. Janet has written written and edited a great number of books, including the quotable Darwin, Darwin, Very Interesting People, which he co-authored with Adrian Desmond and Jim Moore, a beautiful little biography of The Origin of Species, of the book, which was actually published in Hebrew. So those of you who want to read it in Hebrew, and it's actually a pretty nice translation. I don't believe you've read it in Hebrew, but they did a pretty good job. And it's a wonderful little book. Of course, all of the work on the Correspondence Project, and a few other books, including the first book, which was a result of her doctoral dissertation, which is called The Secular Arc, Studies in the History of Biogeography. And Darwin, you've become synonymous for me. Janet has written both in academic journals and more popularly about a very wide array of subjects that span topics from squibs and snobs science in numerous British undergraduate magazines around 1830 to Darwin in Caricature, a study in the popularization and the dissemination of evolution, to Rachel Carson, Prophet of the Environment. Besides her scholarship, Janet is a very loyal and beloved citizen of the community, the worldwide community of the history of science. She has been on the editorial boards of the major journals in the field, like ISIS in History of Science, but also journals like the Journal of Maritime History, and has been the editor a number of times of the British Journal for the History of Science. She's also a trustee of the Charles Darwin Trust at Down House, and does things like consulting for the Encyclopedia of the Life Sciences on Botany, or the Dictionary of 19th Century British Scientists on Life Sciences. She's a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, the American Philosophical Society, and a corresponding fellow of the British Academy. Janet is also a wonderful mentor and teacher. She's been recognized for that work and for those roles in many ways. But she has mentored many research projects of students that include topics such as microscopy in 18th century Europe, history of South African scientific institutions, dinosaurs as museum trophies in the early 20th century. Now you're remembering all the faces. Stephen Jay Gould as a public intellectual, 19th century feminist responses to Darwin, Middle East evolutionism, concepts of the biosphere, 1930-1950, and even glaciology in Canada. Having said all that, I just would like to conclude with the most important thing of all, which is to say that I have met many great scholars in my life, but it's a rare thing to meet in any walk of life someone so generous of spirit like Janet, who is a wonderful friend and a wonderful colleague. And when you talk to Janet, and I hope that some of you have been able to do that today, and you tell her about your ideas and share your thoughts and things that you're working on, you immediately feel as if she's jumped on the truck with you, and you're in the project together. I think it comes from some kind of great well of curiosity, but also from very very deep and generous wells of empathy. Janet was my host a few years ago at Harvard, and it's a wonderful thing to be able to reciprocate just in a small, tiny manner, and to have you here with us today. So I'd like you all to give a nice round of applause for Janet Brown. Sorry about that.
So I am now extremely embarrassed and will find it very difficult to speak to you tonight. Thank you, Oren. Thank you. That was incredibly generous of you. It's not a me that I recognize, so thank you very much. And I'd especially like to take this moment to thank Oren and his colleagues for making this invitation and for making my visit so stimulating, so exciting. It's a great honor for me to be speaking both to an audience, a public audience, and to the Israeli Society for the History of Science, History and Philosophy of Science. It's my first time in Jerusalem. It's my first time in Israel. And so I'm incredibly grateful for this also. Thank you for the invitation. And although Oren didn't mention it, I'm the retiring president of the American History of Science Society. And it's a double pleasure for me to bring the greetings of a sister society to you on your annual meeting. Bernie Lightman is the current president, and he sends through me his very warm regards to you for your annual meeting, which has just been completed. So, to the business of the day. I wonder if we could have the lights down a little at the front, just to, thank you, that's terrific. Gives him a bit more of a profile. So Charles Darwin surely needs very little introduction. He's the great 19th century naturalist who proposed that living beings, including ourselves, evolved by natural means without the intervention of any creative deity. In 1859, the clarity of that insight and the power of Darwin's vision, which was expressed at length in his book On the Origin of Species, published in 1859, Darwin's vision offered real answers to some of the biggest natural history problems of his day. And nowadays, very nearly 160 years later, the theory of evolution by natural selection not only provides the leading conceptual framework for modern biologists, but it's also widely influential in fields as diverse as literary theory and behavioral economics, just to mention two. And of course, as historians, we know that Darwin was not the only person to propose this theory, nor can that moment properly be called a revolution, or it's certainly not a Darwinian revolution, since so many similar ideas were circulating at the same time. Moreover, Darwinism has been tainted in the past, since he first proposed his theories, by the events of the Second World War. And internally, the theory itself has undergone so many changes, particularly with the introduction of the classical theories of genetics, the emergence of population biology, and nowadays genomics, that the theory's changed dramatically since it was first proposed. Yet, what I want to talk about today is the way that Darwin himself, as a figure, is seemingly one of the most famous scientists that the modern public knows about. And why might that be so? When members of the modern public talk about evolutionary theory, they frequently mean Darwinian evolutionary theory. The two words seem to be synonymous for many people. And if they have an image of a scientist in their mind when they're talking about it, it would be an image of Darwin. And it's very frequently this image of Darwin, painted by John Collier in 1881, in what turned out to be the last year of Darwin's life. Collier was the son-in-law of Thomas Henry Huxley and gave very considerable emotional empathy to this portrait that I personally find very moving. Many people do find it a rather remarkable portrait of a scientist that shows nothing about the science in it. You would not know that Darwin was a scientist from this portrait, but you would know that he was a good and kind man from this portrait. And what I hope will be interesting this evening will be to historicize Darwin's fame and to explore with you a few of the perceptions and representations that that have emerged since his death, principally in order to ask how these have changed over time. I won't exhaust you with a long discussion. I've just a few short case studies to offer to you, and that I hope will open up questions about the construction and reconstruction of a notable scientific figure and the possible purposes that these afterlives, these these later images might have served. So the different ways that the figure of Darwin has been constructed or recruited and appropriated adds, I think, some new life to what most of us now in the field would think of as a very hagiographical tradition. And my first case study is the present day in the Anglophone world, which I'm afraid to say is where I operate. Darwin is commemorated and represented in transatlantic culture in an astonishing variety of ways that I just want to run through very quickly with you. You may already know, of course, that there is a city named after Darwin in northern Australia. There is a computer program named after Darwin that now is, of course, defunct, but was really quite something else 10 years ago. There is a rock band named after Darwin in Italy. There are movies that were produced in 2009 for the, or at least actually were available earlier, but were meant to commemorate the 150th anniversary of publication of the Origin, British movies starring Darwin. Paul Bettany, as it happens, but Paul Bettany masquerading as Darwin. He appeared in the New Yorker. He has a Twitter feed. There are toys that allow you to play with Darwin the Naturalist and HMS Beagle. This is a Lego set. And for the beer-drinking people amongst our community, there are, this one in particular was also produced for the 2009 anniversary, Darwin's Downfall, where you'll see on the label that instead of going from chimp to mankind, it goes from mankind to chimp. And again, some of you may already know these images, that this is a young woman anthropologist, a female anthropology student who has the Darwinian, famous Darwinian evolutionary tree on her torso. There are other tattoos that I won't bother to show you, but this is the most attractive, I feel. And of course, many of the individuals who nowadays would wish to talk about evolution have in their mind exactly this evolutionary series that was not anything that Darwin himself either illustrated or discussed in very great form. This sequence from chimp to human being is a 20th century phenomenon, but has roots in an illustration produced by Thomas Henry Huxley. So the sense of what evolution means to the modern day public, it probably means something like this textbook, this school book illustration from chimp to man. I've been living in North America for a number of years now, and it seems to me that much of the American response to Darwinism in the modern period, the last 15 years or so, is expressed through the vehicle, through the automobile. Here we have, actually it's somebody's, it's the front, it's the bonnet of a car. The fossils say no from a car, an automobile in Georgia. And then the other side of the coin is expressed, this is a car plate from Massachusetts, that allows the culture in which I live at the moment to express themselves through the transport system, basically. And what I want to ask is, what is the historian to make of these high levels of cultural visibility? Clearly, Darwin's not just a historical figure, he's also a present-day phenomenon with wide reach. Here in the images that I've shown, his ideas are made material in a variety of interesting commodities, interesting representations that express something important about the way the public tends to regard science and its history, and that's what I'm dwelling on today. One reason, of course, is the very great significance of the book itself. I wouldn't wish to downplay the importance of ideas in the history of science. Darwin's book was a magnificent intellectual achievement that had very many ramifications. I wouldn't want to downplay that. But another reason that I think we might want to call into play is from the sociologists of science, which is that science tends to move forward through an accumulation of discoveries and reconceptualizations of phenomena that are frequently given people's names. So each major shift in ideas is often personalized in a way that not only provides an ancestry for our current scientific edifice, but also, and here I cite a friend, Stephen Shapin. Stephen Shapin proposes that by naming the scientific theories after people, as the people who propose them, it signifies something very important about the truths that are being stated and established. Darwin occupies a legitimate place besides the other great figures of the Western scientific tradition: Newton, Galileo, Copernicus, Marie Curie, Einstein, and so forth. Yet I think we can add something more even to this, that the pervasiveness of Darwin as a person in modern culture seems also to reflect the public's very strong interest in the scope and the power of science, their questions about the place of religious faith in an increasingly secular culture, and the dominance of genetics in defining who we are. Darwin today has perhaps become a figurehead, or even an icon, of a brave new world characterized by the materialistic, genetic vision of human origins. And I think, having seen these few images, I'd like to propose that criticism or praise for Darwin and his commodification in toys and beer and other items can substitute for criticism or praise of our modern condition. So that's where I think Darwin could be located today. Going back in time, representations of Darwin are obviously different. If we go back to the last decades of his life, the representations mostly draw on the same themes that I've already outlined, the question of human identity, who are we, where do we come from, but they seem to me to be expressed rather more through the issue of ape ancestry. For example, many British people encountered Darwin's theory through, not actually through reading The Origin of Species, which is a very difficult book, but through the pages of popular magazines and review journals, such as this illustration from the magazine, the British magazine Punch, in which a very obvious joke is being made about humans' relationship, in this case to an ape that could be a gorilla or it could be a chimp. I think it's more of a gorilla, with a little poem to go with it. Am I a man and a brother? Calling on the anti-slavery movement as well. So there were illustrations like this, of course, that draw Darwin's proposals into the cultural world of asking about human origins, which he hadn't discussed in The Origin of Species. Individuals could also come across evolutionary ideas, and in fact Darwinian ideas, through many other images that drew on the idea of ape ancestry. It seems to me, having looked a fair bit at the way that Darwin's theories were being taken up and discussed and criticized, is that apes are a very central feature of that discussion. So people could acquire the caricatures, certainly they could see them, they could certainly acquire this little statuette of a chimpanzee contemplating a human skull. It's by Hugo Reinhold. He exhibited it in 1893, and it was commercially available in 1897. And the open book that you can perhaps see at the base of the statuette, where the calipers, where the ape is holding the calipers on the left, is the Bible, opened at Genesis, chapter 3, verse 5, and the inscription on that book, let's see if I can do this, there says, "And ye shall be as God," an allusion to apes supplanting the place of a divine creator. And lastly, just a few years after Darwin's death, there were plenty of other ways of encountering evolution in the public domain, and this is a song. There's a number more verses, but you get the sense that although Darwin is being cited all the time in these public representations, the theory that is being alluded to is much, much wider, can hardly be confined in many ways. So all these commercial products, these public products, made Charles Darwin himself and the controversy about human origins fully tangible to his own generation and the one that came after him. So that a figure like Darwin could become so prominent in his own day says something pertinent about the growing power of science, the growing status of science in a community that was actively engaged in celebrating forms of achievement. Leon Braudy and other cultural critics have suggested that the ability to create fame was an important feature of a nation committed to progress. Being able to climb the ladder of renown reflected the relatively fluid structure of 19th century transatlantic society, the existence of opportunity, perhaps, or a high estimation of personal virtue, or the cultural endorsement of self-determination through the writings of Samuel Smiles and others. Alan Friedman and Carol Donnelly's innovative study, Einstein as Myth and Muse, and more recent studies about Einstein for the 20th century, show the value of investigating scientific celebrity in this way. And there are, of course, many studies. Panina Abiram is an expert in this area and I think is with us today. Studies by Panina, Jeffrey Cantor, Ludmila Jordanova, Rosalind Haynes, and Patricia Farah make the case that it can be immensely suggestive to discover exactly what kind of achievements were most respected at various times. So moving onwards, that was one of my case studies. This extends that same case study, moving into the 1920s in Great Britain. Those anxieties about ape ancestry seem to have been somewhat soothed by the proliferation of biographies and publications that dwelt on Darwin's good and modest family life, his life as a thinker in the heart of his family. Darwin's son Francis was instrumental in creating the image of his father as a gentlemanly naturalist, capitalizing on the heroic imagery of Thomas Carlyle. And in Francis Darwin's Life and Letters of his father, and then subsequent volumes, more letters, And then a series of biographies, one of which was written by Francis Darwin, but mostly they were written by other people, drawing on Francis Darwin's texts that were regarded as primary sources in those days. Darwin emerged as an affable, humble, and dedicated naturalist with strong family affections and no wish to scandalize the Anglican Church of his day. And a sanitized version of his personal recollections, now called his autobiography, was published to great acclaim. And if I have time, there's a small anecdote about Lytton Strachey, the well-known, or at least in the English tradition, well-known debunker of the Victorians. His book, Eminent Victorians, was intended to puncture the self-satisfied nationalism of British culture in the pre-war period. And Strachey intended to have Darwin as one of his Victorians, one of his eminent Victorians, and then read the autobiography, Darwin's Recollections, and discovered that he'd fallen in love with him, that he simply couldn't see any point in, or he couldn't see that Darwin was anything other than a hero and needed to be kept out of his book. So tied up with these shifts in imagery was the creation of a museum in Darwin's house in the United Kingdom during the 1920s, a museum that celebrated Darwin's achievement in very cozy, familial, and nationalistic terms. And this is a picture of Darwin's home here, Down House in Kent. It's a contemporary picture from the 1880s. It almost looks like that now. And plans were set in motion after the First World War, after the end of the First World War, by the Royal Society of London to buy this home from the family for the nation and to turn it into a museum. There were many lengthy financial difficulties, during which time the British geneticist William Bateson wrote around to all his scientific acquaintances across the globe to solicit support, including Thomas Hunt Morgan. But this raised not enough, and the house was finally purchased by a philanthropic medical surgeon called George Buxton Brown, who is here, looking at his property just before the opening. Buxton Brown was a surgeon who had lost his son in the war and wished to do something useful with what would have been the son's inheritance. And the house was refurbished and opened in 1925 as a museum celebrating Darwin's life and work. It's still open today. It's still a very moving and interesting place to visit. But my question is, why should British scientists wish to do this? There was no talk of creating a Newton museum. And perhaps as the developed world was becoming modern in the aftermath of the war, with big science racing ahead, automobiles on the street, early skyscrapers, the movies featuring in newly urban cityscapes, perhaps it became important to show British science, at least, as responsible and ethical pursuits. The interwar period in Britain was marked by uncertainty, and possibly the figure of Darwin was perceived to be useful ballast at an unstable time. And to be specific, Darwin's scientific life was not laboratory-based. Indeed, he used his greenhouse and his garden for many, many small practical experiments, and his study, which is shown here, and his study, which is shown here, to research and to write. Nor did Darwin ever need to take paid employment, so his focus was not on a university environment or a laboratory environment at all. A family inheritance made him prosperous enough to carry out his research without any ties to professional institutions. So here in the museum and in the gardens, Darwin's workplace was encountered as a domestic space, markedly different from the labs or expanding universities of his day. So at Down House, science was humanized as patient observation, meticulous research, and needing only minimal experimental equipment. Darwin purchased a Zeiss microscope late in his life and regretted it ever after for the enormous, what he had considered to be enormous expense. So in the museum, science is portrayed exactly as in this illustration, this photograph, as the pursuit, the slow and peaceful country pursuit of a gentleman. And Darwin himself was presented as an observational naturalist who enjoyed family life, a charming image that still delights visitors to the house, but it's an image. There's another Darwin in there. There's several other Darwins in there. So a quick comparison of this picturesque British vision with evolutionary science in North America at the same time points up the contrast. In North America, in 1925, the Scopes trial was taking place, a bitter clash between science and religion that took to the law courts over the rights of teachers to teach evolutionary biology in high schools. So while Americans watched the consequences of the Scopes trial unfurl, the religious issues of Darwinism barely ruffled the surface in Great Britain. The peaceful ambiance, the traditional gardens, the bourgeois furnishings of Darwin's home encouraged visitors to think that world-class science did not need to be threatening for the church or society or even political. And times had changed dramatically. My last case study, by 1959, obviously there's a war in between. By 1959, when biologists wished to celebrate 100 years of evolutionary biology. So this is my last case study. It's the commemorative event held in Chicago in 1959. Many thoughtful scholars have worked on this, on commemoration generally, and on this event, and I'm very pleased to acknowledge their research. So it's interesting why it was Chicago. There was quite a bit of gentlemanly transatlantic rivalry that the British still felt that Darwin was their responsibility, but in fact, Chicago won the conversation, and it was felt that this commemoration in Chicago would serve as the principal occasion to trumpet evolutionary biology on the worldwide stage. There were others, but they were not as large as this Chicago event. So the organizing committee for this event deliberately drained Darwinism of its political expression, seen in the eugenics movement and racial theory in the Second World War. And they used history, hardly at all, but mostly for the special purpose of reinforcing the truth of natural selection theory. They had American biology teachers at the front of their minds, first of all in the wake of the Scopes trial, and secondly in the face of rising evangelical Christian movements such as Billy Graham's ministry and emerging creationist groups in San Diego and elsewhere. Upwards of 1,000 school teachers, American school teachers, attended the meeting, and among the invited guests who spoke to them was John Scopes, who had been found guilty in 1925 and was by this point a symbol of the scholastic freedom that the organizing committee intended to communicate to teachers. Another important aspect of the meeting was to affirm American scientific vigor and the distinctive nature of American science, buoyantly free of any deference to the old world. It was an opportunity to show justifiable pride in gleaming new American labs and to advertise the nation's advances in contemporary science by showing the new genetically based, by showcasing the new genetically based evolutionary biology. 6 years previously, the structure of DNA had been announced or described by James Watson and Francis Crick. Molecular biology and population biology were frontline topics of research. Paleontology had taken great steps forward. Cultural anthropology had successfully adopted an evolutionary model, and ecological studies of variation and speciation were more sophisticated than ever before. So the dangerous doctrines of eugenics had been mostly abandoned by then, although deeply hereditarian commitments did remain untanked. And the first of several UNESCO statements on race had been released. The moment seemed ripe to advertise scientific achievement, which is what they did. The organizing committee, shown here, intended to set the agenda in evolutionary science for the next several decades. They deliberately expanded the Darwinian model to include the biochemical origins of life. They rejected, or they encouraged their speakers to reject, any kind of Lamarckianism or self-powered evolutionary trends in the fossil record. They presented rationalism, materialism, and reductionism as the only appropriate way to conduct science, and validated an entirely gene-based understanding of living beings. So during this meeting, Julian Huxley, the grandson of Thomas Henry Huxley, gave what he called a secular sermon in which he declared that religious belief was merely a biological adaptation in the evolution of humankind. He proposed that humans believe in a God of whatever kind only because we have an evolutionary need to do so. And you can imagine the controversy that he generated in making that remark, even in 1959. And in doing so, he deliberately carried on his grandfather's role as a scourge of the church and prominent defender of Darwinism. Julian Huxley deliberately alluded back to the confrontation at Oxford in 1860 when, between his grandfather, Thomas Henry Huxley, and Bishop Samuel Wilberforce about the origin of humans raised by Darwin's book. So I'm hoping to suggest to you that these kinds of issues that are being discussed in 1959 reconstructed Darwin's legacy in what they felt were modern terms. For us, that meeting reveals the biologists of the time establishing a collective identity on the basis of a shared descent from Darwin, while at the same time prescribing the future. And viewed from what we really should call a post-colonial perspective of today, the 1959 Chicago meeting, and this perhaps is a little provocative, I think that meeting appropriated evolutionary biology for the English-speaking world, the Anglophone world, establishing Darwin's legacy as an American and British triumph, and writing out almost all of the pre-existing global reach of his ideas. It's taken nearly 50 years for scholars to reintroduce some of that global history of Darwinism because it's been such an Anglo-American story since 1959. In fact, much of what we believe about modern evolutionary theory was probably constructed during that meeting. And there were consequences in the public sphere. Darwin's intellectual story was retold in a number of very significant biographies that highlighted the role of creative discovery, gave a special role to the genius, to the innovative moment of discovery. And in more technical terms, the Galapagos Islands were recast as a major site of scientific innovation. Julian Huxley, who not only was at this meeting, was the first director of UNESCO, announced that there would be a Darwin Memorial Park created on the Galapagos archipelago. And these plans meshed with international pressure to restrict commercial fisheries around the archipelago, and ultimately helped the Galapagos become a designated World Heritage Site. Now, of course, a major destination for ecological tourism. Particularly for those of us who study the history of evolutionary theory, the whole imagery of Darwin discovering divergence and possibly even thinking of evolution on the Galapagos Islands rested on the finches that he discusses, and the British ornithologist David Lack, at that point, after the Chicago meeting, reissued his book that was called Darwin's Finches, and it became an actual example of evolution in action that it had not been in Darwin's day. So the image of Darwin in 1959 was of a pioneering secular thinker whose discoveries rested very firmly on the personal discovery of biological evidence, and that was subsequently confirmed by laboratory-based successes. And this image, like the others, no doubt served a very useful purpose at the time. So, in conclusion, I've been looking for ways to push beyond the textual historical sources into the cultural and social assumptions of a variety of communities and audiences. I've attempted to do this by thinking about fame, Darwin's fame, historicizing his fame, and the subsequent cultural afterlives of scientific figures. I think it possibly rests on more than just intellectual achievement alone. We know that, we're historians. Thinking of Darwin as a celebrity, as the source of consumer interest, as a figure enshrined in statuary, songs, and images, venerated, caricatured, and utilized for various purposes, restores an extra dimension to history. I think afterlives help us in understanding the processes of making and circulating knowledge in all the complexities of the historical moment. And on the one hand, we're more conscious than ever before of social agency in the generation of collective responses to scientific ideas. And we're also engaging in interdisciplinary studies that encourage us to reformulate the primacy given to great men and women in shaping history. So I think to expose some of the ways in which a person becomes famous has much to offer us in spanning the gap between the new social history and the old style of heroic historiography. Putting it another way around, what Leon Braudy called the frenzy of renown raises useful questions about the conditions that make a scientist visible in his or her own time, exposes the changing agendas that help reify certain people as symbols, and allows us to ask what might sustain that visibility today. So, thank you very much.
So, we're going to have a bit of a discussion, about 20 or 25 minutes, and then open it up to questions from the audience. So, thank you for that talk, Janet. You spoke about Darwin as an icon and Darwin's fame and what kinds of pertinent and useful and relevant historical questions can be asked based on looking at those particular facets of his afterlives. But I want to return backward first and to ask you about the more textual analyses and the very careful historical work that was put into projects such as the Correspondence Project. It's been said of Darwin that he's been done to death. And what I want to ask you, before we reach these meta questions, because before the meta questions came all the hard work of looking at, the manuscripts and so forth, why, as an historian who's spent time on this, why is it important that we look through all of the particular sort of erasures and manuscript deletions and additions in the personal notebooks? Why should we care about Darwin's particular path to natural selection, or about his meanderings around the problem of heredity, or to quote an article of yours, why he retched all night, and what his diet was about, and his the particular conditions of his health situation and so forth? Why are we so preoccupied with it, and what would you say, having done it for so many years, can be gleaned from it? Why is it important?
Well, it is a leading question, isn't it? But I'm on now? Yeah. So I think many historians enter the field because they have a deep commitment and love of books and manuscripts, and the sense of being with the past through books, manuscripts, and other kinds of documentation is unbeatable. It's why some people become artists and some people become historians. So I do feel that the manuscripts have a call to some individuals, that they're sitting there in their libraries saying, come read me, come work something out from me. For Darwin himself, why should we follow through all the deletions, the different sorts of thoughts that he had, the many thoughts that turned out to be not relevant? Why should we bother with these? I think it's allowing us to see science in the making. It's a creative individual, a mind is at work in a notebook style of recording that speaks immediately to us about somebody pushing a problem through. So there's both the sense of our personal discovery as a historian, of being able to share with the author, with Darwin in this case, the processes of thinking something through, but also it's very educational. It helps us as individuals in our efforts to educate others that people take time to come to good ideas, that there's a lot of reworking when you first have a good idea. But if one takes the example of Darwin, of course he has a very brilliant idea and many ways of he thought he had a number of ways to explore that he might provide an answer to how evolution worked. But it took him a long time, but he held on to that good idea. So this is instructive. I don't want to sound so moral about it, but there's also a sense in which we as readers of Darwin's materials get a sense of an individual grappling with many significant issues, feeling scared about them, feeling joyous about them, feeling that he's cracked it, feeling that he hasn't. And this is enormously good for us as individuals and enormously helpful for us as teachers to take this sense of science as a constructed, and I don't mean that in a bad way, science as a made intellectual achievement is a very important thing.
It's always seemed extremely daunting to me, from the point of view of a historian, to choose an historical figure about whom so much has been written. And I sometimes wonder, I've always, sought out people who were forgotten or unknown, and it seemed to me I was so lucky that I wasn't working on, on Newton or Darwin or Einstein, because, no one knows what I know. I found the archive, no one else has found it, and I don't feel anyone's breath at, at my nape, but it also seems to me like it's a different kind of challenge, because you are inheriting many Darwinian traditions when you write about someone about whom many people have written. And so why do you think you were, I mean, obviously Darwin is a wonderful character and he lived in wonderful times, and it's a rich seam for a cultural historian and for an intellectual historian and so forth, but were you never attracted to write about someone completely unknown and forgotten? I mean,
yeah. But Darwin's always drawn me back. It's a very pertinent question. Thank you, Oren. I feel that the size of the Darwin archive, and as I suggested, he was already famous by the time he passed away. There was already a Darwinian industry around him before his death, and his sons and his daughter also carried the flame forward, so that there's a mass of material which for any historian is a gold mine. Much of it to do with natural history in the 19th century, much of it to do with his correspondence with women scientists, much of it to do with his private life, much of it to do with the economies of the railroads. There's a whole resource there that early Darwinists, scholars in the 1950s and 60s, had not really dug into. It was only when the Darwin Correspondence Project began in 1983 that the very prescient director of the project, Frederick Burkhardt, realized that there was such a resource here that needed to be explored and advertised and brought to the public, which is what it's actually still going on, doing that. So I think why I came into Darwin was with the excitement of a huge archive and plenty of material in there that probably one could work on without using Darwin at all.
So let's talk a little bit about the distinction between Darwin, the man, the thinker, the individual, and the Darwinian tradition, and Darwinism. I wonder if you could share with us some thoughts that you have about, again, having devoted so much time to a particular individual, about the pull of the individual on history. What I'm trying to get at is the relationship between the sort of idiosyncrasies and contingencies of one's life and career and ideas, and the way they interact with much broader social, political, ideological phenomena that can be analyzed historically as trends and so forth. So it's a classical question in intellectual history, the relationship between the individual and broader the broader culture. And as you showed nicely, and we'll talk about a little bit more, over time after Darwin, in Darwin's Afterlives, many different people have used Darwin to, for their own ends, both scientists and historians. But is there a certain pull of the individual that kind of constrains the ways in which the afterlives can develop and evolve, or does it completely sort of, once a person is no longer with us, and even during a person's own lifetime, there's absolutely no control over what can be done with ideas?
Thank you. What an interesting question. I do believe that those of us who wish to work on an individual are always tied to the documents, to be truthful to the materials. And anybody writing a biography would wish to be that person. and yet there's also the role of the imaginative reconstruction that's necessary, because we don't have that person in front of us, and even if we did, we wouldn't necessarily be able to delve into that person's deepest thoughts that one would wish to put into a biography. So there's a, I don't want to get into history of psychology too much, the question of what the mind is composed of, but there's plenty of opportunity, even in someone's lifetime, for that person to represent things that are very separate from their own lives. And I think we see that with Darwin. We certainly see it with Einstein. We see it with Robert Oppenheimer. There's a whole bunch of people where you can see that happening, that they become public figures and they lose control of who they are in the public. And of course, they are the same person, but they have been turned into something slightly different. I'm sorry, that's not a terribly coherent answer.
But it is striking, uniquely with Darwin, the extent to which vying interlocutors have read him in completely different ways. Going all the way back to, Huxley and Kropotkin. For Huxley, it was nature bloody in tooth and claw. Yes, nature was neither moral or non-moral, it was amoral. And there were very particular social and political lessons to be learned from that. For Kropotkin, it was the metaphor of the plant at the edge of the desert was what interested him and captured his attention. He thought that competition led towards mutual aid, and there were the political corollaries of that leading him to anarchy. And then jump ahead 70 or 80 years, and you have this great debate between Steve Gould and Dawkins. One putting the emphasis on developmental constraints, that being Gould. The other one putting the emphasis on the all power of natural selection with large populations and enough time, basically natural selection being able to do anything. And in both these cases, all four of the interlocutors score themselves, loyal Darwinians. So it's been very interesting to see over time how Darwin really is almost like the Bible. Anyone can find anything that they want to find in him.
It's not a bad metaphor. I think if we step back from the individual and remind ourselves of the very many other people who were writing and suggesting evolutionary ideas of various kinds from the 1770s onwards, that we tend, because of the way science is discussed, to prioritize an individual in the big changes that happen in culture. And we have, I think, overemphasized Darwin as the key figure in what we now call the Darwinian Revolution. If we didn't call it that, if we called it something like the evolutionary revolution, it would help us in these issues that the Darwinism is an ideology. It's a huge thing that is emerging, taking shape, and is now a concrete structure for modern biology, for the modern world, that one man just can't do himself. And his name has been given to that movement. He was a crucial part of it. His book was crystallized very many points of view, brought them out into the open. But it was going on before him, possibly for 100 years before his time, and it continues today. So I feel that that's our answer to this conundrum, is that we're not doing the right thing by overemphasizing Darwin.
And yet there's a bit of a there's a bit of a paradox here, because on the one hand, we spend so much time looking at the minutia of the manuscript additions and erasures, and on the other hand, were critical of scholars who have tried to maintain Darwin's purity by separating him from the consequences, the social and political consequences of his theory. So things like, aggressive capitalism or fascism or eugenics and racism, colonialism, nationalism, later on the IQ debate, moral anarchy, and so forth. So on the one hand, there are people who try to maintain his purity that way. On the other hand, there have been others who have taken very seriously the connection between what Darwin wrote and what other people and movements did with them. So there's a title by a historian by the name of Peter Weikart called From Darwin to Hitler. And he takes very seriously precisely what was done with Darwin's ideas. So where do you stand on that gamut between, on the one hand, saying, okay, we shouldn't overemphasize the individual, and on the other hand, actually, replicating your seriousness in scholarship when you look at the manuscripts to the, when you look at the consequences, the social consequences of what was done with his ideas?
So my personal view of Darwin in this particular instance is that he was responsible for the way that his ideas were used in completely reprehensible ways, but he didn't know that was going to happen. So he understood in his own writings that his theory was dangerous. He didn't possibly foresee the ways that it could be used. So I think he was responsible, but could be absolved from that responsibility. He's not confronting the bomb in the way that some of the physicists did. He didn't see it happen. That doesn't make it any better, but it does mean that he's separate. He's not pure, but he is separate, I think, is what I'd like to say on that.
Now let's return to the iconography and to the fame. So you presented it here: songs, rap, cartoons, costume dramas, children's books, and so forth. And I guess what I'd like you to talk about a little bit more in focus is why do you think that Darwin has become such an icon, really in a way which is unmatched? I mean, maybe it's matched by maybe by Einstein, but Darwin, there's something very special about Darwin, the icon. And what do you think Darwin would have thought about all of this?
Gee whiz. I think Darwin would have been tremendously embarrassed. So we do know that he had views about his own celebrity. They come out in his correspondence. He was amused by the caricatures that were produced about him. His friends sent him copies of them, and he kept them, which is why in the Darwin archive we know what the caricatures are, because there's a very fine collection that Darwin collected. So that's, he was amused by it, and in a properly Victorian way, embarrassed and sort of reticent about the whole thing. People who visited his home always were very surprised at how modest and straightforward he was, that he wasn't a big shot in any kind of way, and people loved him for that. I've lost my track now, I'm so sorry. I think my private theory, and I'm very open to extensive critique on this, my private theory as to why he is so very much in the minds of modern biologists is that Darwin represents, for biologists who are confined mostly to a lab, he represents the naturalist in all of their hearts. that Darwin was an observational naturalist. He liked beetles. He liked going out on expeditions. He loved the real stuff of nature. And my personal theory is that many biologists find themselves separated from nature. Even when they're on field trips, it's still collecting stuff to bring back to the lab. It's not working in nature. And that Darwin has, through his autobiography and other things that people have read, through The Origin of Species, this is full of little stories about nature. Darwin is the real naturalist that they keep in their hearts. So that's my theory. Okay.
So there's a story. We'll open it up in about a moment. There's a story about Thomas Kuhn, I think, attending the 20th anniversary or something like that of the structure of scientific revolutions. Is sitting at the end of the theater, and they're just ongoing deliberations about what about Kuhnianism and what Kuhn meant and so forth. And then he screamed from the back of the auditorium, "For God's sakes, don't call me a Kuhnian." And the same is true for Darwin. Darwin is one of these cases where there were a group of people who called themselves neo-Darwinists, who made claims that to a large degree constricted what Darwin had said and threw out a lot of what he had paid attention to and even close attention to and thought was important. And that constriction had a very crucial impact on the directions in which biological thought went in the 20th century. And there are some people in this room who are now preoccupied with returning to Darwin and trying to rescue ideas that had really been thrown aside by those who called themselves by his name. And that's something that we see happening quite often in history. Maybe last question before we open up. Looking forward towards 2059. It's not all that far away. 2059. Time passes very quickly. Can you venture any kind of a guess at what kind of a Darwin we'll find then? Who will Darwin be in 2059? Is there any way to have any kind of an imagination about that?
Well, isn't that fun? If it wasn't so far away in the future, I would suggest that Darwin would be recreated in, let's say, 10 or 12 years' time as the very man who knew all about phylogenomics and who was sensitive to the discoveries that we're making just now about epigenetics. There's you've already mentioned how much of Darwinism was thrown out in the last 20 years. That epigenetics, the inheritance of acquired characteristics, was something that's very prevalent in Darwin's writings. It's in The Origin of Species, but is just ignored today as not being the proper Darwinism. So I think that will come through, but 2059 is a very long time away, so I can't project that far ahead.
Okay, let's open up. I saw Yaron had a question. Do we want to use the, yeah, just wait 1 second. Yaron.
Thank you, Professor Brown. It was very illuminating, very entertaining. I just want to suggest that a lot of insights can be yielded by comparing Darwin's perhaps the most prominent, most famous scientist of the 19th century with the most prominent, famous scientist of the 20th century, our friend Albert Einstein. And there has been a lot of attempt to do the kind of work you have done with Darwin, with Einstein, and trying to understand first of all, the personality of the person. There were all kinds of mythologies surrounding him, as you know. The myth that his grades in school were shameful, that he was unacknowledged genius until 1905, what is called the miracle year of his great discoveries. His connection to the atomic bomb, which is so rich with all these complexities and cultural implications, and his Zionism, his excommunication by the Germans, and so forth and so forth. But the interesting thing in the comparison between the two of them is that Darwin went to a journey of an explorer to the high seas as an observant. He wanted to observe. Whereas Einstein did the most spectacular, amazing journey in his own mind. And this was really, he is perhaps the most outstanding dramatic example for how a journey of the mind of one person can totally change the history of science. And this is, I think, a highly interesting comparison. What? You want to say something? Okay. His theory was also the least accessible. The New York Times published 12 editorials after the famous publications of Einstein saying that only 12 people understand what he was trying to do. At the same time, over time, and that's part of the reason for his sustainability over time, his predictions, first of the redshift, then of the, more recently, of gravitations have been confirmed. So we have here very interesting, different types of science, different types of personalities. Einstein also was trying to, I suppose, I don't know if it was deliberated to stick his tongue out before the camera, that he became one of his most famous photographs, but he also he appeared to be much more accessible than his theory. So I think such comparison would fit very much what I know about Harvard University. It's a good project there, although I know Gallison did some of this. The two books which were published by Princeton's, with which I had the honor of being involved. One is Einstein for the 20th century, and then Einstein, what?
It's coming. May I respond?
And then Einstein for the 21st century. We are both historians, so I'm very excited. We're really trying to do something very similar to yours.
Yes. So I thank you for the question or the comment, and I think you're exactly right that to make a comparison between great figures, great thoughtful figures, this one would be very illuminating between Darwin and Einstein, I do agree. To make such comparisons or to produce a volume in which experts in their own field are touching on the same questions, historical questions, would be very illuminating. And you mentioned my colleague Peter Gallison at Harvard University. We could make a real nice book. And although this is just a personal remark, I don't mean to make this amusing. I am currently engaging with two other colleagues in putting together an undergraduate course that is called Darwin, Marx and Freud. It's where we intend to do the same thing. And I may add for the female scholars in the audience, we're going to include their daughters.
Eva? Wait. Can someone give Chava the... It's all right?
I can repeat.
But then, okay, go for it.
The afterlife of Charles Darwin, the afterlives of Charles Darwin, sort of are related to the afterlives of other people, of other great scholars. So Yeah, there was a period where during the sort of last third of the 19th century when Lamarckism was on the rise, and people were very interested in Lamarck, and they also created an image of Lamarck and wrote a biography. There was a biography of Lamarck, which was very limited because not much was known, because there were no archives. There is very little there. But the interaction of the afterlife of Darwin and the afterlives of other people that interact with his theory, I would like to hear what you have to say about that.
So the question is, what about all the other figures in evolutionary biology and perhaps other fields, the late 19th century, who similarly have been taken up and developed by other groups? Lamarck must be the most prominent of these, I would say, and I would love to have some conversation about Lamarck with you, because I was very intrigued to find out if from the 1959 Darwinian commemoration how dramatically they expunged Lamarckism from the record. Which, yes, I know you did. I'm looking forward to talking to you about this. So the sort of the Darwinian circle, the Huxleys, Thomas Henry Huxley, Joseph Dalton Hooker, Alfred Russel Wallace, who I didn't mention tonight, have all become the objects of these kinds of studies. What happened to them in the public eye? How were they co-opted and drawn into contemporary scientific debates? Thank you.
Gentleman over here, yeah. Yeah.
Would like to ask about what is your opinion in light of the new technologies that are involved in the genetics, like the CRISPR, that you can introduce changes that took millions in maybe few hours. What would how to ask it? What would Darwin think about it? That changes that are during all the history of the Earth could be now introduced, and what will be? You asked 2059. What will be the mankind? What will be the outcome of this intervention in the evolution?
What an interesting question. Thank you. I can't speak for Darwin, although I've written all this stuff about him. I just can't speak for him, but I would imagine that he would be very excited. He would take some while to understand about DNA. He obviously had no inkling of Mendel's genetics, let alone what we now know, so that it would take him some time, but I think he would go for it. He would really try to work it out, and then I think he would be excited. I think, like all of us, he would also express caution as to how this could be used, but the actual technologies and the fact that it can be done, and that it would CRISPR now does offer the potential for very extensive medical remedies, that he would be pleased by that. So, thank you.
Neil?
When you use an expression like the struggle for existence, which you didn't mention at all in this lecture, and it's interesting, you should think about the consequences of what will happen and the justifications that you give to other people in the future to do with it. And there are a lot of expressions of I don't want to judge negative or positive, but a lot of expressions of war or conflicts in his theory, and then people used it. And I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, that things are changed now, and people talk more about cooperation in nature, working together, evolution of two species and more together, yeah, and it's now being changed. So you may look at these consequences also of what is happening to the evolution of evolution now on the future regarding the question on 2059, if you see what I mean.
I think I do see what you mean. Thank you. I feel very strongly that the evolutionary theories that are adopted by someone like Richard Dawkins are not the evolutionary theories I believe in. So when I'm working on Darwin, I'm not bringing modern biology to his materials. I've tried to interpret them as they stand in front of me. I'm with altruism. I'm with Oren and George Price on this one. But I do understand exactly what you're saying. And I think, yes, if I'm going to pursue this work further, I should also take very careful account of the phraseology, the struggle for survival, the survival of the fittest. These are all key phrases that had an afterlife of their own. Yeah, thank you.
Vered.
So 1913, Freud writes his Totem and Taboo, and he positions himself in the book as Darwin's successor in a way, because he carries the narrative of the primordial tribe and so on. But in fact, Freud's Darwin is Lamarckian, which Darwin himself also was, as we know from you, and also Hegelian. A doctrine that Darwin was somewhat more critical of, as far as I know. And from Haeckel Freud and others, Freud took the evolutionary thing, the developmental thing. And I was wondering if you would talk a little bit about Darwin's contribution to the emergence of these ideas about development and the whole developmental side of his theory of natural selection. And I have another question. This one is like, the first question is related to my research, but the other one is like a personal thing that I'm really curious about, been for a long time. Darwin had a mutual relationship with psychiatry of late 19th century. Of course, he had an intellectual interest in the field, but he also alluded to the fact that he had an unknown side to him, a dark side of Darwin. And I'm always wondering about the price someone pays for actually hiding as he did for so long, not publishing, being conflicted or ambivalent towards his own theories, his own revelations. And so I was just wondering. Thank you so much.
Thank you. So the first question was, what was the impact of Darwin's work on developmental theory? The development of the mind in particular, which is a very difficult question to answer. And I can only really respond in terms of what Darwin himself thought about the development of the mind. What Freud took from it is very different indeed. And Darwin quite clearly believed in an evolutionary development of mind, a hierarchy of mind, He felt that there was a primitive mind, if I may use this expression, and that there was a civilized mind, and that you could trace that development by looking at modern society and extrapolating back to what it may have been like in the past, which we now know is a completely unhelpful methodology. So he has views that one finds in The Expression of the Emotions and The Descent of Man, those two books, that really don't hold water today, I feel. Yes, thank you. He, as a father, Darwin was, of course, very proud and engaged and interested in his children and began to record their development, their developing minds. He was also interested in their developing physical abilities, but much less so. So that the diary he wrote of his first child, who was a little boy, and then the second child was a girl, and he was interested in her because she was a little different in the sequence of events. He wrote quite carefully about their language development, their consciousness, the development of consciousness, and all the things that modern parents are also interested in. But he wrote it down, and it's a record, it's an archival record that many scholars find completely absorbing. That was turned into a little text at the end of his life about the development of a child's mind. It's not about the development of the human mind over many, many eons of time. And your other point, gosh, I'm sorry, you're going to have to refresh my memory. What was your second point?
The dark side of Darwin.
The dark side of Darwin, yes. So what a good novel that would make. And many of us have attempted to write it.
Was he depressed? Like, was he?
I'm sure he was.
Was he happy?
I'm sure he was, and he may even have been clinically depressed using modern diagnosis. But he managed to work through it. And if one really wants to psychologize it, the difficulties that Darwin found in his writings made him ill. And he could only get relief from those difficulties by being ill. So the illness is, in fact, the way he got out of his difficulties. I think it's really very intriguing. We know a lot about him and his illnesses, and a very fine book was written by a New York psychiatrist called Ralph Culp about whether Darwin's disorders, we must call them disorders, were psychosomatic or physical. The pendulum has swung back to physical disorders. People are very keen that he should have something physical because it removes his mind from that darkness that you're expressing. Yeah.
Yes, maybe one last question. Okay, so we'll go to that side too. Yes, sir.
So I would like to go back to the idea of fame. So science has difficult ideas for the general public to grasp. It's difficult to understand scientific ideas. And maybe the public needs geniuses to connect with these ideas. Sometimes the connection is through a picture, like we know Schrödinger not because of the Schrödinger equation, but because of the Schrödinger cat. And we also need a story behind it. Like Newton, we remember the apple falling, or Darwin going to the Galapagos. So sometimes I think it's the personality of the scientist. For instance, Stephen Hawking is very dramatic in being a scientist. So it's difficult for the public to grasp the science. So they need icons. And they don't view science as a group or society of researchers working towards a goal. They see it in one person having this bright idea, and this iconifies it for them. Just one last point. I think what makes Darwin so special is what we find in science, that science makes us as humans humble. He puts us aside. We're part of a whole universe and not something special, where this is viewed as a feud between science and religion, where religion puts man in the center as opposed to science. So I was wondering about your view of these.
On your last point, of course, Darwin and all the others who were putting forward evolutionary ideas together made a new world where we are not the center. And that's hugely important. So I'm completely move with you on this question. On your earlier remark about the public and even ourselves, everybody, we're all the public, needing geniuses, I'm sure that's true, but what I would like to add to that is that makes it very difficult for science teachers, because they are trying to show how science is a cumulative process with lots of little bits being put together, that people are standing on each other's shoulders, as Newton famously says, that it's an endeavor that changes and needs input and continuous work. And for young people to think, oh, it's a genius, it's all done by geniuses, genii, and I can't be that person. So it's hard to keep that image of genius circulating when so much of science does not require genius.
Okay, so I don't want this section of the hall to feel like anyone has anything against you. So the way we're going to do it is you two gentlemen ask your questions one after the other, and then Janet will reply.
In terms of political thought, when we say Darwin, we think social Darwinism, Spencer, and you didn't speak about it. How Darwin would have think about Spencer?
Next question. Thank you.
Thank you. You spoke about, you mentioned actually the benefit of going to the field and to the journeys or research with the world and not about the world in the lab. Do you see it as a benefit in general for all scientists, because it is straightforward in anthropology and if you research movement or music, but it's less straightforward when you speak about physics or chemistry or computer science. So do you see this as maybe a guiding effort as a scientist in general?
Thank you very much. On the question of Herbert Spencer, there's plenty of contemporary materials suggesting that Darwin did not understand him. And not that that exonerates Darwin in any way, but he did adopt Spencer's term, survival of the fittest, and had plenty of views about the society that Spencer was mapping, basically. I cut out my bit about Spencer because of the time that I was doing, but I think the social Darwinism as social Spencerism is a really significant shift in terms. It's never caught on because Spencer didn't have all the same kind of imagery associated with him that Darwin did. And it's been one of the really big questions that I'm struggling to answer, is that there are all these interesting philosophical and biological figures, Spencer prime among them, but it's Darwin that rises to the top. Why did Darwin's name become the name that everybody attributes to this way of thought? And I don't know, basically, but it's a really interesting problem, and thank you for drawing it to our attention. Herbert Spencer, very great thinker. Thank you. And I'm afraid I'm not quite sure that I understand what the second question was. It's the relation of the more technological sciences to biology today.
Yeah, but mainly you touch upon the concept of going to where life occurs and being with the world, as opposed to sit in a lab and just research something conceptually, or just or just go to the field to collect things. So do you see this tendency as something that we all as scientists should try to achieve? Be with, in the field and not in the lab too much, and approach to life, because life is movement.
Right. So I wouldn't dream of making a lifestyle suggestion to scientists. Those many scientists who I know love being out in nature. Of course they do. That's what they like to do. I was merely only suggesting that perhaps some of the meaning of Darwin for these modern friends of mine rests in the fact that he was predominantly an outside person. That they, my girlfriend Naomi Peirce, who's a butterfly expert, has only 3 weeks in the field every year. And those 3 weeks are dedicated to catching and preserving and taking back. She's not actually enjoying this. She's thinking, oh, here's another 2 weeks' work. So that for her, Darwin represents freedom, being back in the natural world. So I wouldn't recommend. I don't know what computer engineers think. They're free in the internet, in the ether. So I think perhaps we should have a further conversation on this. Thank you.
So I'd just like to say it is quite remarkable how an individual in history becomes the hub, aside from all the interest in Darwin himself as a human being, for what grew into cottage industries in the history of science, dealing with race and empire, with science and literature, with science and religion, with field studies, and the role of going out to nature. Obviously social Darwinism, but also, gentleman science and method, and dissemination studies and gender studies and so forth. But I want to end with actually a very personal question about Darwin. If you could share with us the most delightfully surprising fact or story about Darwin that no one knows.
This may not be the most delightful one, but it's certainly one that springs to mind. Darwin had a very close friend called Charles Lyell, the geologist, whose book he had had with him on the Beagle voyage. And Darwin was a very devoted disciple of Lyell's geological system, and when he first came back to Britain from the Beagle voyage, he came to know Lyell very closely. And there's a letter from Darwin to Lyell explaining about natural selection. And Lyell wrote back, and there was a word in Darwin's letter that he couldn't read, and Darwin had very poor handwriting, and Lyell had cut it out and sent it back to Darwin saying, what's this? What's all this about natural persecution? And Darwin wrote back immediately saying it's not persecution, it's natural preservation. So that's all I can offer.
Thank you so much, Shannon, for this lovely evening.